Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A few days ago we did a great interview with Michael Livingston, who teaches history at the Citadel, one of America's leading military educational institutions. Michael is an expert on the 100 Years' War, and he has a new book out. It's called Bloody Crowns, A New History of the 100 Years' War. And in our conversation, I asked him, this is, of course, a war that ended, or supposedly ended, about 600 or 700 years ago in a very distant place, in a very distant world. And I asked him if there was one thing he could know about the 100 Years' War. He said, well, I'd like to have seen it. I'd like to have been on the front. And thinking about my conversation with Livingston reminds me of our conversation today. We're going from a very distant war to a very immediate one, the Iraq War, which, of course, took place between 2003 and 2011. There's a fascinating new movie coming out on November 10th on PBS by my guest today, Michael Pack, very distinguished American movie director and writer. He runs a studio called Manifold Productions, and the movie is called The Last 600 Meters, an Iraq War documentary about Najaf and Fallujah, the two dominant battles in the war. Michael is joining us from Chevy Chase. Michael, congratulations on the upcoming movie.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
I bet you're not going to have any conversations where references are made to the 100 Years' War, a very distant kind of war. But in all seriousness, Michael, might one argue that the Iraq War is too close to make an accurate documentary about? We need a few hundred years of distance, of perspective, of hindsight to really get it right?
Well, you could. I mean, it's often said that the news is the first draft of history. I like to think of documentaries as the second draft of history, but it's always drafted and redrafted. You know, people will be rewriting their history of this war like they have of the 100 Years' War, you know, forever, for 100 years from now, 200 years from now, and it'll look very different. And that's the process of history. People are always saying, you know, history will vindicate me. But of course, history changes all the time. What I think we had an opportunity to do, which is exactly what, picking up on your comment, what your guest asked, is to get a sense of what it was actually like on the ground. So our film does not speculate into the causes or the meaning of the Iraq War. We look at the two biggest battles of the war, just as you said. In fact, they're the two biggest battles America has fought since Vietnam. And we tell the story from the ground truth, what it was like to be there, from the corporals and sergeants up to the one-star generals that were in the field, from the point of view of people who were in the battle at every level. So they're really battle stories, like a story about Gettysburg or Iwo Jima or any other battle, Trafalgar or something, and maybe more like Waterloo.
Or thinking of the 100 Years' War, Agincourt.
Or Agincourt. In fact, there's a scene in our film where this is leaping ahead a little bit, where a Marine officer tries to rally his troops by quoting the lines from Henry V to them, believe it or not. It's a very bizarre and amazing scene. You wouldn't think that this very junior officer and these young Marines would be moved by these lines of Shakespeare's, or that they would have a place in the Iraq War, but there they are. So, you know, it's a very unusual moment. So yes, even our film, you know, folds that into it. But we tell the stories of the battles. You know, Henry V is actually the story of the politics of the battles. We're giving the ground truth, and we were able to do it because we filmed the interviews not recently, but in 2006, when the battles were only 2 years old. And the people that were in them could still remember them well, and they still look like they did in the battle. And our technique has been to use actual footage from the battles and interview the people in the footage. So it works well that it's so recent. I mean, it's taken a long time to sort of get it on the air, but it really captures the feel of the battle. And whatever people think of the Iraq War, it will be a useful reference to them, no matter how many years they speculate on it. And that truth, the ground truth, that will remain the same. What they think of the Iraq War, good or bad, what does it mean? That will change. So I think our film will be relevant in the future. And I think it's particularly relevant now when wars like the war in Ukraine and Gaza are going on with a similar kind of urban combat.
Yeah, and particularly given the fact that most people spend most of their time, it seems, on social media, and they see all this imaginary violence and can't quite experience it themselves. You suggest, Michael, or maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not trying to make a commentary on the Iraq War, but is it possible to discuss it without being political? You're perhaps right of center politically. You've been on the Bannon show. You've worked for Donald Trump. Can one make a movie, for better or worse, critically or otherwise, about a war as controversial and political as Iraq without being political? Even if you aren't political, isn't that a way of kind of being political?
Well, I think you're right, Andrew. I myself have strong political views, like most people. I promised the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, my principal funder, that it would not be political. But it's political in the sense that you see decisions in Washington having an impact on the people at the tip of the spear. First, you may remember the first Battle of Fallujah began when 4 Blackwater contractors were killed, burned, dragged through the streets of Fallujah, then hung from a bridge. And that image caused Washington decided that the military had to clear out Fallujah. And they went in, and negative publicity about that battle caused them to pull out and hand it over to insurgents who ran it for 6 months until they had to go in again. And while the insurgents were running it, it was just a safe haven for Al-Qaeda fighters and an arms depot and a scene of torture and even beheadings. So yeah, the politics flow through the film, but without comment, and we see simply how the soldiers and Marines have to deal with them. So I would say, on the case of it not being political, when it was first in the first draft of the film, when we showed it, when the Iraq War was still hotly debated, people who were very big proponents of the Iraq War, like Richard Pearl, loved the film, and people like Steve Bannon, who were opponents of the Iraq War, also liked the film, and they both felt it justified their political views. So I think that's a testament to the fact that the film portrays the events on the ground fairly, and you can interpret them as you will.
What are your politics on the Iraq War? Were you in favor of it?
I think my views mirror a lot of the public. I was initially in favor of it, but I came to see it as a waste, although I believe that one of the things that condemned the Iraq War to be such a waste of resources was this conflicting political demands. Our goals were not clear. We can enter into these wars if we have clear goals that are in America's interest and we have the means to achieve those goals. We had goals that were themselves shifting, were beyond our capacity to do. And I think that made for an unwinnable conflict. So I share the public's eventual disenchantment with the war, but I was initially in favor of it. I was convinced by the weapons of mass destruction's argument. I mean, I'm not any smarter maybe than the general public in America. I don't claim to be a military expert. So those are my views on the war.
You've compared, you compared 600, the last 600 meters in terms of the fronts of Najaf and Fallujah with Gettysburg and Iwo Jima, maybe even Agincourt. If it isn't a political film, if it's just showing troops in action, What will people learn? Are the lessons Shakespearean? Are they tragic? Are they heroic?
I think they are both heroic and tragic. And I think those things often go together. Some person, I think it might have been Stanley Kubrick, someone once said every war film is an anti-war film. And that is a true statement. On one hand, you see the heroism and valor of these young Marines, and they're mainly Marines, but Army too, and Special Forces. You see their valor. I mean, in one case, Hell House at the end of the Second Battle of Fallujah, they're clearing the city house to house, street by street, and one group of Marines are pinned in this house in crossfire, and another group of Marines have to cross that kill zone 4 times under intense fire to rescue them. They don't all come out unscathed, and you see their heroism. But I think you also see the horror of war. I mean, one of our tanker Marines talks about the smell of Fallujah, the Second Battle of Fallujah. You know, the corpses rotting and the charred bodies, and how it still haunts his nightmares. So it's heroism, but you kind of see the struggle of war and the tragedy of war, and you see its impact on the people of these cities. So it's a mix that I think reflects the reality of modern warfare.
What do you show of the people, and indeed even of the other fighters? Does the last 600 meters, is it an Iraq war documentary pretty much about, from the American, if not the American ideological perspective, with the camera on American?
Yes, the camera's on Americans. So you see the impact on others as these Marines enter these houses or do things. You see them there as bystanders. In some, I think there are some very evocative photographs by a brilliant combat cameraman named Lucian Reed, poetic, I would call them, of the Iraqi population responding and kind of dealing with the wreckage after these battles. Wreckage, I might add, not just caused by the American forces, but caused by the insurgents as well. But, you see the impact on the civilian population. And the war's impact on the civilian populations has always been horrible, going back to, since you were taking this historical perspective, back to plays like the Trojan Women. I mean, it is not, that's the way of warfare, and this one is particularly brutal on civilians. So you see it from that point of view. But we are following it's called the last 600 meters because a sniper says, I don't make foreign policy, I just deliver the last 600 meters of it, meaning what he can see through a sniper scope. And that's our focus. We see the impact of this from the point of view of the American military dealing with the last 600 meters and its impact both on them, their buddies, the military, as well as the population around them.
How well do you think American media, which you're an authority on lots of different fronts, and movie makers, documentaries or fictional movie makers, how good a job have they done with the Iraq and Afghan's wars? I mean, they seem to have done a good job with Vietnam, at least in terms of critical approaches. I recently saw Apocalypse Now for about the 10th time. It's still a remarkably powerful film. Have they done as good a job with Iraq and Afghanistan as they've done with Vietnam? Maybe you don't agree they did a good job with Vietnam.
Well, I don't think that they have done a great job with these wars. Maybe it's perhaps the level of dramatic filmmakers that have had to that have gone to make the films. War films are challenging, and Hollywood needs to appeal to the population. And I think the American population has been unwilling to think about these wars for a long time. I think there's a general feeling that they were a mistake and that they were bad, and they want to look away. But that is true. They also want to look away from Vietnam. But there's, even with Vietnam, there's not the huge number of films that were about, say, World War II, both during the war and after the war, both great films and kind of shallow propagandistic films, a huge flood of them. So I don't think Hollywood has quite done well by it. There have been a bunch of documentaries, but I think people remain confused about these wars, what it was like to fight them, and what happened there. And I make documentaries, so I'm a big believer that you really need to learn from the past and not look away from it. So I don't think they've done a great job. There isn't a great Iraq film that's easy to point to. You have things like Zero Dark 30 and Kurt Locker, but they're not at the level of Apocalypse Now or the great World War II films. I'm a big fan of They Were Expendable, John Ford's film about World War II. But people still be making films about these things into the future, so we'll see.
Yeah, you mentioned Kubrick, his great anti-war films. Dr. Strangelove seems, if anything, even more relevant today than it ever was. As you said, you're a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. War films are challenging. Most of your films have been less military, less about war. Your last one was about the birth of nuclear power. You've made films about Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Clarence Thomas. What was the challenge for you, and indeed the opportunity as a documentary filmmaker, Michael, in doing the last 600 meters?
Well, I often say that there are two kinds of artists and filmmakers: people who like to make the same film many, many times over, maybe in a different setting. I like Ken Burns's films, but they all have the same style. I've really tried in my career to tackle different kinds of subjects in a different sort of way. So this was an opportunity to deal with what was then still ongoing. So, as I mentioned, I shot these interviews in 2006. So it was a chance to sort of deal with something that was ongoing in terms of multiple first-person testimony. My film about Clarence Thomas was also all first-person testimony, but from one person, from Clarence Thomas. This was a chance to make a collage of first-person testimony combined with footage from the ground, that had been shot by our interview subjects in some cases, and bring that to an audience. So it was a challenge, a different sort of filmmaking challenge, and then it's always exciting to wrestle with these big issues like war and what it's like to be in war.
Yeah, I made a documentary film a few years ago called How to Fix Democracy, and we're actually doing a follow-up next year. I know how difficult it is on the economic front. The business model is very challenging. How did you finance the last 600 meters? I know it's being distributed on PBS, but I assume this isn't financed by PBS, is it?
Well, its principal funder is, in fact, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Not quite PBS, but public broadcasting. As you say, we've done 15 films. They've all been broadcast on PBS, one on TLC. But this one was principally funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And we finished a version of the film in 2008. As I mentioned, we shot the interviews in 2006 when the soldiers and Marines could still remember the battles and were the same age as they were in them. We finished it a few years later, and PBS initially declined to broadcast it. They said it was too pro-military, which I don't actually think it is. I'm not sure how terrible that is. And for many years thereafter, we begged them to put it on the air since they had principally funded it, and two foundations as well. And it was only this last year that the president of PBS, I think very courageously, reversed these earlier decisions and granted us this primetime slot right before Veterans Day, where we are really the PBS offering to deal with both the 250th anniversary of the Marine Corps, which is November 10th, and Veterans Day, the following day, November 11th. And we're on 10 p.m. on the 10th. And your viewers and listeners can catch it afterwards on PBS app and then later on Amazon.
So will it be free? You'll be able to watch on PBS for free?
Yes. By the time it's streaming, then you probably have to pay for it. So if you can catch it on November 10th, it'll be free. But yeah, financing is challenging and the distribution is challenging, especially for right-of-center films. So
do you see this as a right-of-center film?
I don't really. I think it's apolitical, but I think I am widely perceived as a right-of-center filmmaker. But the thing that makes it maybe right-of-center is, maybe maybe non-woke, in that it does take a positive view of the military. As I say, PBS initially thought it was too pro-military, and it doesn't have a rah-rah view of the military, but it shows these Marine and Army officers and special forces doing heroic things. And so it's pro-veteran, I would say. At the time, that made it right of center, maybe less so today. So I don't really see the film itself as that. But I am sympathetic that it's an uphill battle for people trying to make right of center films. So although I'm president of Manifold Productions, our new films are done under the banner of Palladium Pictures, a new company that we started, that in addition to making both long-form documentaries and short documentaries, we also have an incubator program to train young right of center or non-woke filmmakers, and not necessarily with very conservative films. It's our feeling that the left really dominates the documentary film world, and what there is on the right are very hardcore polemical films. So what the left really dominates is storytelling films, and it's a matter of which story you choose to tell. You mentioned some of the stories we chose to tell, like we chose to give Clarence Thomas a chance to tell his story in his own words. In Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. Other people had done a hagiographic treatment of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I see no problem with that, but they only interviewed Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her friends. So if you want a vibrant intellectual scene, you really need documentaries made by people from different political positions. Even if they're telling a story, you have to get a range of the kinds of stories they want to tell. I mean, it's true, too, of our Rickover film. You mentioned before the Clarence Thomas film, we did a film about Admiral Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear navy and nuclear power and nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. And, he was a very controversial figure, and we portray him fairly. But that, too, took kind of the position. Admiral Rickover helped win the Cold War, and it sort of had the assumption that fighting the Cold War was good and America was on the right side. So in that sense, it's right of center broadly considered, but we told his story, and other filmmakers for many years were not interested in his story. He died in the late 80s, and we made that film about 5 or 6 years ago. So I think you need a diversity of filmmakers to get a diversity of films, even if they're not very polemical. And so our incubator is to train young filmmakers. You can go there now and apply. It's at palladiumpictures.com if you're a young or not so young filmmaker.
Well, I was thinking, Mike, if I wasn't so old, I would have to apply myself.
Well, we have people from 35 to 45 and
Maybe
up.
I'll dye my hair.
There isn't actually an age limit, but we give the people who apply money to make a film, money to make a short 15-minute film, and we oversee it.
How much do we give them? How much does a 15-minute film usually cost?
Well, we give them up to $35,000, and Andrew, you'll be not surprised that almost every budget comes in at almost exactly $35,000.
Yeah, well, mine will. I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't charge you any less than $35K. In all seriousness, Michael, it seems like some issues actually change. I mean, you talked about right of center. You were at least a Trump guy. You're close to Bannon, so you're certainly not on the left of American politics. But some issues like nuclear power, which began as quite a right of center issue, now has become a left-wing one. I mean, I've done a number of shows recently with, seems to me at least, leftist activists who believe that nuclear power is the solution to everything. And in a way, could it be said that the same is true of war and American troops? That you could never have made this film after Vietnam, which is showing American troops in a positive light. But today, when last 600 meters come out, there'll be reviews that perhaps talk about you as a right of center figure. But I think the left in its own way is as sympathetic to veterans as the right, aren't they? And in some ways, given the isolationist nature of some of the MAGA movement, maybe the left is more sympathetic to veterans than the right.
I agree with you that these issues change over time. And some to take them in order. Nuclear power, I think it's great that some people on the left are embracing it. I think it's long past time to do so. There were strong opposers of it, starting in the 1970s, of course, and the Rickover film deals with that. But yeah, if you're serious about climate change, and I am not a person super worried about climate change, but if you are, nuclear power is really the logical answer. It's taken them a long time to come
Right,
to
and
it.
that's the argument. It's very much the environmental left that's picked up
But
nuclear power.
I don't really see it that way. I think it's an alternative. I think the argument against nuclear power is that oil and gas are so cheap and plentiful, and the fracking revolution has made them even cheaper. I mean, I think it's good to have multiple sources. Nuclear power is a good one. Oil and gas are good as well, and that is my view. But I think it's great that the left is coming to it. I think it's perhaps even more significant that China has taken the lead in nuclear power. I mean, they are building a huge number of nuclear plants and at much lower cost and much more modern than our nuclear plants, even though we developed the technology, as that film Rickover, The Birth of Nuclear Power, describes, still available, still streaming on Amazon. And we developed it, we created it, now China is taking the lead in it. So I think that we really should address that as a country. And I think you're right. Maybe now, 50 years later or even more, the time is right for that. And I think views of the military have shifted too. They always shift. Things like that shit come and go. And I think you're right that even the left now is, I would say, pro-veteran, and that might be one of the reasons why our film, which PBS initially declined 17 years ago, they have accepted 17 years later. So maybe the film is right for its current moment. So yeah, these things change. The challenge to me, I think, as a filmmaker, is not to make films that just reflect those shifting views, but tell the underlying story that remains true, whatever the shifting political opinions on top of that story.
You talked about this film being financed by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. In the first Trump administration, you were the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. As you know, it was a controversial time. I found an NPR piece suggesting that you left a trail of shattered careers at the Voice of America. You recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal back in March of this year, talking about how the Voice of America is broken and can't be reformed. I wonder, Michael, whether there's any contradiction between your skepticism towards government-funded media and the fact that this new movie you've come out with was funded by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting.
Well, first of all, I'm not skeptical of the government supporting something like the Voice of America. I'm skeptical of the effectiveness of the Voice of America as it is conceived. I mean, that article in the Wall Street Journal called for a rethinking of what to do with international broadcasting and public diplomacy generally. I think a lot of these institutions in the government are broken and they need to be rebuilt from the ground up. They can't really be reformed by getting rid of the bad and keeping the good. And I try in that article to detail why, and I have a slightly more detailed take on it that I wrote in The Federalist. So I do believe the American government has a role in promoting American values abroad and countering propaganda from China, especially, and Russia and Iran and our enemies. I do not feel that is not a proper function of government. Whether the government should be funding public broadcasting is a different sort of question. But it's my view, really, that filmmakers, are right to take funding where they can get it. Just like I think I'm skeptical that we need a Department of Education, but I wouldn't say, well, we have a Department of Education, people shouldn't be trying to use its grants as effectively as they can. So I'm not sure that there is a contradiction. These are also complicated political discussions themselves. And by the way, I did get that grant 20 years ago, so things were a little bit different back then.
What did you learn from your time in government? I mean, my sense with you, Michael, is that your great love is filmmaking. I mean, you may have done this for a bit, but what wisdom did you gain from it? If Trump called you again and said, "I want you back in, and you need to do this or that," would you do it?
I would be reluctant to go into government, but I always say, and this was true, I've been in government 3 times, one under George H.W. Bush, one under George W. Bush, and once under Trump. And I would be reluctant to go in again, but if the president asked me to, then I don't think I would have really much choice. If President Biden had asked me to do something, I think I have to do it. They're the president of the United States. Fortunately, they're not going to look at little me and ask me to do something. But I think I learned a lot. I mean, I make lots of films about politics and government, and it was really very different to be inside it. I mean, I learned a lot that helped me make my film about Clarence Thomas, for example. That was really the last one that we had broadcast nationally on PBS. We've done some more recent documentaries with the Wall Street Journal opinion section, which I'm happy to talk about. One about England, Britain, actually. But the Clarence Thomas one, because it followed his career and it tells his story in his own words, so it wasn't my opinion about him. It was his opinion, his retelling his life story, a complicated, colorful life story beginning growing up in Pinpoint, a Gullah-speaking area off the coast of Georgia, and then his father leaving, his mother taking him to Savannah, a period of dire poverty where he didn't have enough to eat. And rather than go to school, he'd wander the streets, and until finally she took him and his brother and brought him to her father, his grandfather, to raise, who gave him tough love and discipline and sent him to Catholic school. And Clarence Thomas thrived in Catholic school, only in the 60s to reject it all, to reject his Catholicism, to become sympathetic to the Black Panthers and radicals of the 60s, and then to go through a period where he would reject that and become conservative, end up working for Ronald Reagan and being attacked as a Black man working for Reagan, attacks that really culminated in his very controversial confirmation battle when he was nominated to the Supreme Court with the allegations of Anita Hill, and then finally his years in the court. So it's a complicated story, but it was easier for me to understand Justice Thomas's battles in his confirmation. I myself, my confirmation took 3 years and 3 months, kind of a record. I think I could understand it, having done it.
So myself. You mean you only did it for about, what, 8 months?
8 months, right. So it's close to the record. They don't keep these records, but I think it's a record. So I don't think it's nice. I mean, I was really attacked by left-wing media, especially NPR and the Washington Post, but New York Times, everyone, as having done all this damage. But you can't accomplish much in 8 months, damage or not damage, unless you have a huge amount of power, which I did not.
You didn't. You weren't photographed with a chainsaw with any president.
I wasn't empowered to have that kind of access.
Are you rather envious? I know you've written about Doge. You're rather envious of the authority that Trump gave Musk, at least for a few months.
I believe, to pick up that article that you just put on, I believe that Doge represented a possibility of cutting the government back to its constitutionally mandated structure, and that focus only on waste, fraud, and abuse was a missed opportunity. I really feel that there are other reasons that the administrative state is problematic. I mean, one is not only when it's wasteful, but also when they block what the president wants to do, whatever it is, whatever party he is, feeling they know more than the president. And finally, it is an unconstitutional branch of government. Even if they're doing the right thing, they're unaccountable. There are agencies that both effectively pass laws, regulations, then they enforce the laws, and they have courts adjudicating laws, all three functions of government, which James Madison rightly declared the very definition of tyranny. So, but by focusing only on waste and fraud, I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity. I think the impulse was good.
In other words, it was a big missed opportunity, not a little one.
Maybe.
Let's end, Michael. You've been very generous with your time. Let's end with something about the last 600 meters, which, as you say, got very close to the battles for Najaf and Fallujah at the beginning of the war. But let's zoom out for a little bit and talk about the war in historical terms. How are we going to look back at it? It's increasingly politicized. DeSantis, a few days ago, gave a speech about Mandami, suggesting that from 9/11, never again, to electing a pro-terrorist mayor. I don't know if everyone will agree with that one. But clearly 9/11 and the images that we still remember from that day in September of 2001 still shape the early 21st century history of America. How are we going to look back at this in 50 years? Not just Fallujah and Najaf and the Iraq and Afghan war, but 9/11. What's going to be the conclusion of historians? I'm not suggesting we become Michael Livingston in 500 or 600 years, but in 25 or even 50 years, how are we going to look back at this period?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can pretend to that kind of wisdom exactly.
Well, you're wiser than me, and you've given it some thought, and you've spent a number of years on this film, so I'm sure you can.
We have another film on these wars coming out as well. As I mentioned, we have a partnership with the Wall Street Journal opinion section to do short documentaries.
Yeah.
The first two are ready on their website at wsj.com/opinion docs. One on the worst anti-Semitic riot in American history, which was Crown Heights in Brooklyn in 1991, and one on the prime ministership of Liz Truss, and called the Prime Minister versus.
I hope you're not an admirer of Liz Truss.
It's a very multi perspective story. You have to watch it, Andrew, and tell me what you think.
Well, I don't want to. Well, maybe we'll get you back on to talk about Liz Truss. But my interpretation of Truss is that the market spoke, and it's the only way to shut some of these people up. But that's my political opinion. But
you've got to watch the film and tell me. It's free. It's on.
Okay, well, I will do. Maybe we'll get you back on to talk about Truss and this anti-Semitic riot, which is also interesting.
But one of the new films we're working on is about withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is at the other end of this process. And I think it was a disaster, and we try to analyze the disaster. But these things are very complex, and I feel that they do represent the failure of American elites. In the same way that Vietnam did too. I mean, in a way that is a continuation. You started with that historical parallel. The people who managed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and General Milley, and they are among the most talented and credentialed men in American society, yet they made many disastrous decisions after one disastrous decision after another. And so how does that happen? And the question is, what can we fight and win wars? And I think that's an important thing for America to grapple with now. How we look at it, I think, Andrew, like I say, people will probably shift in their views on perhaps on the whole global war on terror idea. Clearly, a war on terror as a concept maybe never made sense, but let's just say the threat of radical Islam that we were alerted to after September 11th. I think a very real threat, a threat that is there now. I mean, I think you could look at it in terms of Iran's influence on the Middle East. What to do about it, I don't know. How that'll end, I'm not sure is known either. So perhaps it's still too soon to write the final chapter of that story about America and radical Islam.
What was that famous Chou En-lai remark when I think Kissinger asked him at one of these meetings what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said, too early to tell. Well, it's not too early to at least look back at the American war in Iraq, especially the battles of Najaf and Fallujah, the last 600 meters. Michael Pack's new movie. It's out on November the 10th, the day before Veteran Day on PBS. So I think everyone should watch it. Congratulations, Michael, on the movie. And we'll get you back on. We'll do a Liz Truss show. It'll be really interesting. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you, Andrew.